There is a city above the Arctic Circle where, almost every night, thousands of windows glow across crumbling apartment blocks. From far enough away, on the approach by train through the tundra, it almost looks alive. A cluster of warm yellow lights against an otherwise black, frozen nothing. Get closer, though, and the details stop adding up. Some of those lit windows have curtains frozen mid-sway, never opened again. Snow has piled so high against certain entryways that no living person could push a door open from either side, and spray painted across one, stairwell, in faded letters someone clearly wrote in a hurry, are 3 words: people live here, not decoration. A warning aimed at whichever utility crew comes through next, begging them not to. Switch off the heat to a building where, in some cases, exactly 1 elderly resident remains. This is Vorkuta. On paper, it's still a Russian city of tens of thousands of people. In practice, it may already be something else entirely, the fastest shrinking city in the country, and quite possibly the largest forgotten city on the planet that almost nobody outside Russia has ever heard of. This is a place that has, on record, touched minus 52 degrees Celsius, cold enough to rank among the harshest temperatures ever logged on the European continent. And yet, somehow, that brutal climate is not even the strangest thing about it. Here's the detail that should genuinely stop you. The government is currently spending millions of dollars every single year keeping heat running through thousands of apartments that have no one living inside them at all. Why would any government do that? Why keep a dying city artificially warm year after year, long after the people who once filled it have already gone? That answer is coming, and it's stranger than you'd guess. But to actually understand it, you first need to understand how this place got built, who built it, and what it cost them. Because the story of Vorkuta doesn't start with coal. It starts with prisoners walking into the snow with no idea if they'd survive the week. On paper, the case against anyone living here at all is almost laughable. Vorkuta sits more than 150 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle in a stretch of permafrost so extreme that the ground itself never fully thaws, even in summer. Winters here have produced a recorded low of minus 52 degrees Celsius, cold enough that touching bare metal with an ungloved hand can cost you skin in seconds, and a cup of boiling water thrown into the air turns into a falling curtain of ice crystals before it even reaches the ground. For roughly 2 months a year, the sun doesn't rise at all. Locals don't measure winter mornings by daylight. They measure them by how dark daytime darkness actually is. But brutal cold isn't really what isolates Vorkuta. What isolates it is the fact that, in the most literal sense possible, there is no road. Not a rough one. Not a forgotten gravel track that locals use in summer. If you want to reach Vorkuta by land, in any season, you have exactly one option: a single rail line, the same one originally hammered through frozen ground by prisoners in the 1940s, on which a sleeper train now crawls north out of Moscow for the better part of 2 days before it finally pulls in. Picture boarding that train in a warm, crowded Moscow station and watching the landscape outside the window slowly strip itself bare. Fewer towns, fewer trees, fewer signs that anyone lives out there at all, until eventually there's nothing left but white tundra stretching to a horizon with no edges. By the time you step off onto the platform, you understand something in your body that no map could ever tell you. You are now further from help than almost anywhere else in this part of the world, and therefore nearly everything about how Vorkuta survives, how it's fed, fueled, heated, and kept barely alive, comes down to that single rail line and a handful of weekly flights. Sever that thread, even for a few days during a bad storm, and this city of tens of thousands is, for all, practical purposes completely on its own. There's another detail about time itself here that's easy to miss until you actually live through it. Because Vorkuta runs on Moscow time despite sitting far to the east, the sun on an average clear day rises earlier here than almost anywhere else on the planet. And then, for 2 straight months of winter, doesn't rise at all. Locals stop talking about morning the way people elsewhere do. Daylight becomes something you check for, almost like checking a weather app, rather than something you simply wake up into. Twice a year, the sun rises after midnight and sets before noon, which sounds like a riddle until you realize it's simply what happens when a normal 24-hour clock gets stretched across a place this far north. So why would anyone build a city here in the first place? The uncomfortable answer is that nobody actually asked the people who built it. In May of 1931, a small expedition, 39 men, mostly prisoners, escorted by guards and a handful of geologists, set out on foot and by river from a settlement far to the south, sent to confirm rumors of a massive coal basin buried somewhere beneath this stretch of Arctic tundra. They weren't equipped like explorers. They were equipped like people who were expected to be expendable. Within weeks, men were dying of exposure, sickness, and starvation long before anyone had even broken ground on a single mine shaft. More prisoners followed anyway, because the state had already decided this coal was too valuable to abandon over a body count. By 1932, the survivors had scraped together a small outpost on the banks of the Vorkuta River. That outpost grew into the city you're looking at today, and the system built to run it, a sprawling forced labor operation that would become one of the largest single camps in the entire Gulag network. Picture, for a moment, an organization that wasn't one prison, but an administrative empire of 17 separate camp sections and dozens of subcamps spread across hundreds of kilometers of tundra, all answering to the same command structure, all digging the same coal seams. Remember that single rail line we mentioned earlier, the only land route in or out of the city even? Today, that track didn't appear by accident either. Through the early 1940s, prisoners hammered it through frozen ground, swamp, and permafrost by hand in a construction effort that was, in its own right, almost as deadly as the mining itself. By 1941, the line finally connected Vorkuta to the rest of the Soviet rail network, which meant the camp could now ship coal out far more efficiently and ship in far more prisoners far more easily. The same railway that built this city's only lifeline to the outside world was completed by people who had no say in whether they lived to see it finished. It's worth pausing on just how big this system actually was, because labor camp doesn't quite capture it. Vorkutlag wasn't a single fenced compound. It was the administrative center for an entire web of camps and subcamps stretching across this corner of the Soviet Arctic, the largest such network in all of European Russia. Orders, prisoners, and supplies moved between Vorkuta and satellite camps hundreds of kilometers away, all coordinated from the same command structure. Picture an organization with the administrative footprint of a small province, except instead of producing anything for the people living inside it, its entire purpose was extracting coal and obedience in roughly equal measure. At its peak in the early 1950s, more than 70,000 prisoners lived and worked inside this system at once. Political prisoners, prisoners of war, so-called enemies of the people thrown into the same mine shafts as ordinary criminals. During the camp's worst years, before reforms in the mid-1940s, the death rate inside the camp reportedly climbed into double digits as a percentage of the prison population in a single year. People froze on outdoor work details in conditions that would shut down a modern construction site within hours. People starved on ration. quotas calculated for a labor output the human body was never designed to sustain at -40, and the coal kept moving north along that railway anyway, because the entire reason this place existed was that the state needed it, and the cost in human lives barely registered as a line item. Now imagine actually living inside that system. A typical shift didn't start with daylight, because for months at a time there wasn't any. Prisoners were marched out in darkness, worked underground or on outdoor construction details for hours in temperatures that could freeze, exposed skin in minutes, and marched back in darkness again, often too exhausted to feel the cold anymore by the time they reached the barracks. Frostbite wasn't a risk here. It was closer to a guarantee, just a question of which shift it finally caught up with you. Clothing meant for a temperate Russian winter was stretched to cover an Arctic one, and shoes wore through faster than. Replacements arrived. Food was rationed against output, which meant the weakest prisoners, the ones who could least afford to eat less, were the ones most likely to receive less. And yet, somehow, people still found ways to hold on to something resembling a self inside all of that. Survivors who later wrote memoirs after reaching the West described prisoners trading dark, jokes about their guards, inventing private nicknames for the weapons pointed at them, finding small, almost invisible ways to undercut a system designed to strip away every shred of personality and identity. It's an uncomfortable kind of resilience to think about. Humor used not as comfort, but as a last form of resistance against a machine that wanted prisoners to stop thinking of themselves as people at all. There's a bitter irony buried in the unofficial nickname some prisoners gave this place, the capital of the world. Not because it was glamorous, but because of who actually ended up here. Lithuanian partisans, German prisoners of war, Ukrainian nationalists, a celebrated Soviet screenwriter sentenced on fabricated charges after falling in love with the wrong woman, foreign doctors swept up in post-war political paranoia, people from dozens of nations and backgrounds, all funneled into the same frozen coal basin, building railways, sinking shafts, and constructing the very apartment blocks that, decades later, would stand half empty with their lights still, burning through the polar night. For 2 decades, that arrangement simply held. For a long time, almost none of this reached the outside world. What we know now comes largely from a handful of survivors who eventually made it to the West and wrote down what they had lived through, while it was still raw enough to remember in detail. The standoffs, the rumors, the strange, fragile camaraderie that had formed among prisoners with nothing else left to hold on to. Without those accounts, this entire chapter might have simply stayed buried under the tundra, along with everything else the camp tried to bury. The camp here was formally dissolved in the early 1960s, but unlike most labor camps, Vorkuta itself didn't vanish along with it. The city kept growing. Real apartment blocks, a university, hospitals, a grand cultural palace for miners, family housing, even a small airport. An entire, functioning Soviet city built directly on top of a labor camp's foundations. Some of the people who stayed were former prisoners with nowhere else to return to. Others were free workers, lured north by genuinely high wages and the promise of building something that mattered at the very edge of the map. For nearly 3 more decades, that arrangement actually worked. Vorkuta grew into one of the most important coal-producing cities in the entire Soviet Union, eventually swelling to close to 250,000 residents, with 13 separate mines ringing the city like spokes on a wheel. Streets filled in with new housing blocks. A miner's cultural palace hosted concerts and basketball games. A young speed skater born here would later go on to break a world record on the global stage, an almost unthinkable export for a city built on a labor camp's bones. For a while, walking through Vorkuta in the 1970s or 80s, you could almost convince yourself the entire brutal gamble had paid off. that something genuinely livable had grown out of all that suffering, the way. Certain plants are said to grow best in scorched soil. And then, in 1991, the empire that had built this place, funded this place, and given it its entire reason for existing simply stopped existing overnight. What happened to Vorkuta next wasn't sudden. It wasn't one dramatic collapse you could point to on a calendar. It was something slower, and in its own quiet way, every bit as brutal as anything that came before it, a kind of drawn-out unraveling that some historians who've studied this city now describe less as a single disaster and more as a decades-long, ongoing one. And it's the part of this story almost nobody outside Russia has ever actually heard. In the messy, half-improvised capitalism that replaced Soviet planning, Vorkuta's coal business didn't transition smoothly into the new system. It nearly collapsed under it. State subsidies that had propped up uneconomical Arctic mining for 60 years disappeared almost overnight. Mines were privatized, debts piled up, and one by one, the pits that had defined this city's entire identity began shutting down for good. Of the 13 mines that once ringed Vorkuta like spokes on a wheel, only 4 are still operating today. And here's where the human cost of that collapse gets impossible to romanticize. The smaller, mining settlements scattered around Vorkuta, built purely to house workers for a single pit, had no reason to exist once that pit closed. So people left, fast, in whatever order they could manage. Picture walking into one of those abandoned 5-story apartment blocks today. Front doors left wide open, swinging slightly on rusted hinges because whoever left didn't bother, locking up behind them. Furniture still sitting exactly where it was last used. Children's toys scattered across floors. Family photographs nobody came back for because hauling anything heavy out of the Arctic on a single rail line with no road and no money simply wasn't realistic. People chose to walk away from their own belongings rather than gamble on a housing market that had already collapsed underneath them. One of those settlements, Komsomolsky, once housed roughly 20,000 people. Today, by most counts, fewer than 200 remain. The streetlights there still switch on automatically, every single night, illuminating empty streets and empty courtyards because nobody ever reprogrammed a system built for a town that used to be full of life. Komsomolsky isn't alone. Drive, or rather ride a service train, through the settlements once, strung around Vorkuta's old mining ring, places like Severny and Vorgashore, and you'll find the same pattern repeating itself with almost mechanical consistency. A school with no children in it, a grocery store with a handwritten sign instead of a working sign, an apartment block that's 3/4 dark except for a single lit stairwell at one end, the chalk or paint marking which entryway still technically counts as occupied. Locals who still live in these places have started using their own informal shorthand for it. Not a ghost town exactly, since people are still there, but something closer to a town that's been quietly switched off room by room with the last few rooms, simply taking longer to go dark than the rest. Then, in 2016, the collapse accelerated again in the worst possible way. A methane gas leak inside one of the city's last major mines triggered a chain of explosions that killed 36 miners in a single incident, one of the deadliest coal mining disasters in Russia in years. The mine shut for good. Families who had already watched the city shrink for 2 decades packed up and left in even greater numbers afterward. It became one more entry in a grim pattern locals had started joking about, that the surest way to predict Vorkuta's future was to watch which mine closed next. The retreat hasn't only hit housing and jobs, it's hit the systems that keep people alive in an emergency. At its Soviet peak, the wider Vorkuta district could call on something close to 30 separate medical facilities. Today, Locals describe relying on essentially one main hospital for the entire remaining population. For anything serious, a major surgery, a complicated birth, a condition the local hospital simply isn't equipped for. The only real option is evacuation by plane or by the same single train line to a hospital roughly 900 kilometers south, weather and schedule permitting, in a city that spends a third of the year in darkness. With isolation already weighing on people, that's not a small detail. It's the difference between a health scare being frightening and being genuinely life-threatening. Now here's where we come back to that detail from the very beginning. The lit windows, the warning painted on the wall, the millions of dollars spent every year on a city that's disappearing. Anyway, across Vorkuta and its surrounding settlements, there are now roughly 15,500 empty apartments. A significant share of them remain connected to the central heating grid at a combined cost estimated around 570 million rubles a year, somewhere in the range of $7 million spent annually to keep hot water flowing through buildings where, in many cases, literally nobody lives. Here's the part that sounds almost absurd until you understand the engineering underneath it. This isn't sentiment, and it isn't bureaucratic waste for its own sake. In permafrost country, heating. Pipes aren't a comfort feature. They're load-bearing infrastructure for an entire frozen ecosystem of buildings. Walk through parts of Vorkuta and you'll notice the pipes aren't even buried. Thick, insulated lines run above ground between buildings, looping over streets and alleys like exposed veins, because digging permanent trenches into permafrost is its own engineering nightmare. If hot water stops moving through those pipes, the water inside freezes solid almost immediately. Frozen water expands, pipes burst, and once one section of a shared heating loop fails in this climate, the damage doesn't stay contained. It can take down the network feeding buildings that are still occupied in a city where temperatures sit below -30 for months at a stretch. So the heat stays on. Not because anyone believes these settlements are coming back to life, but because switching off one empty building can, in the wrong conditions, threaten every occupied building wired into the same loop next door. The lights you see glowing across these supposedly abandoned neighborhoods aren't a glitch, and they aren't symbolic. They're the visible side effect of a system that physically cannot be switched off, not until every last resident has been resettled, which at current rates could take generations. And that's not an exaggeration. Resettlement programs do exist, offering subsidized housing for residents willing to relocate elsewhere in Russia. But the waiting lists run into the thousands, with only a few hundred families relocated each year. Some residents who applied over a decade ago are still waiting for their number to come up. Elderly former miners, many of whom arrived here decades ago, full of state-sponsored optimism, now quietly doing the math on whether they'll be moved out before they die here instead. If you think Komsomolsky is the strangest fate a Vorkuta settlement could meet, there's one nearby story that's even darker and almost too strange to be real. About 70 kilometers north of the city sits a former mining settlement whose name, translated from the local indigenous language, means something close to River in the Valley of Death. A name that predates the Soviets entirely, originally describing ground the area's native reindeer-herding people had long used as a burial site. The first geological expedition sent to confirm coal deposits there, back in the early 1940s, very nearly didn't make it out alive, caught in brutal weather. The team tried to haul their equipment and supplies by reindeer caravan, and out of 100 animals pressed into the attempt, 86 died before the cargo ever reached its destination. Coal mining started anyway, and a full settlement grew up around the mine through the Cold War. But by the early 1990s, the seam wasn't profitable anymore, and by 1995, the entire settlement was officially shut down. Residents who refused to leave voluntarily were eventually removed by force. Here's the twist almost nobody expects. That dead settlement didn't just get abandoned and forgotten. It got repurposed as a live bombing range for the Russian Air Force. Strategic bombers now use its empty apartment blocks as target practice during military exercises. And in 2005, footage emerged of a long-range bomber dropping ordnance directly onto the ruins, reportedly, with the country's own head of state observing the exercise from aboard the aircraft. In a strange way, it's a role this region has played before. During the Cold War, Vorkuta itself hosted a forward, staging base for long-range Soviet bombers, part of the same strategic chessboard that made the entire Arctic frontier valuable to begin with. Decades later, the empty settlement nearby isn't staging bombers anymore. It's the target. A settlement built to extract coal for one empire, abandoned by that empire's successor, is now used by that successor's air force to practice destroying things. There may not be a more fitting or more brutal metaphor anywhere in this region for what happened here after 1991. With all of that in mind, the real question isn't why Vorkuta is dying. It's why anyone is still here at all. Because despite everything, this is not technically a ghost town. Tens of thousands of people still live their entire lives inside it, and for them, all of this is simply normal. A collapsed building at the end of the street, an empty stairwell on the way home, faded murals on crumbling, concrete still promising a bright future that clearly never fully arrived. None of it is shocking to a local. Kids walk past entire dark, hollowed-out apartment blocks on their way to school the same way kids elsewhere walk past a corner shop, barely registering it as unusual at all. It's just the backdrop of an ordinary Tuesday, the visual wallpaper of an entire childhood spent here. There's an odd economic paradox sitting underneath all of this, too. Because of the hardship pay built into Arctic and northern postings, wages here can actually run higher than the national average for comparable work further south. But almost everything has to be shipped in along that same single rail line. Fresh produce, building materials, basic appliances, even fuel for vehicles. And every one of those journeys adds cost on top of cost by the time it reaches a shop shelf in Vorkuta. So residents often find themselves earning more than people doing similar jobs elsewhere in Russia, while simultaneously paying noticeably more just to live a normal life. It's a strange kind of balance. Not poverty exactly, but a sense that whatever you earn here, the Arctic, finds a way to quietly take a cut of it right back. With formal infrastructure shrinking every year, many residents have quietly built their own workarounds. Fishing and hunting supplement what the shops can't reliably provide. Locally built, tank-like all-terrain vehicles known as Karakat, welded together from spare parts by people with no other way to move through thick, snow-clogged tundra, have become a strange but completely ordinary sight on the streets, somewhere between a snowmobile, a tractor, and an armored vehicle. Out beyond the city limits, the region's indigenous reindeer herders have continued doing something they were doing centuries before any Soviet geologist ever set foot here. Every autumn, herds numbering in the thousands are still driven toward Vorkuta to be traded. A sea of antlers and steam breath moving across the open tundra, herders in traditional dress working, alongside snowmobiles and the occasional homemade Karakat, all converging on the edge of a kez built from concrete and coal dust. For a few weeks each year, two completely different timelines collide in the same patch of ground, a way of life that predates the Gulag by centuries, and a Soviet industrial city that's already busy disappearing. Neither one seems to notice the other very much. The herders keep moving on their own seasonal clock, almost completely indifferent to whatever else is happening in the city beside it. And then there are the people who simply never left, generation after generation, slowly becoming the exception rather than the rule. Imagine growing up in one of these apartment blocks, going to a school where, by the time you're 16, you and basically everyone around, you already understand the unspoken script. You study hard, you wait for graduation, and then you leave the same way almost everyone in the grade above you already has. Almost everyone. Here describes some version of that exact experience. For most of their friends, the script played out exactly as expected. For the ones still here, staying was never really a plan. It was simply what was left over after everyone else's plan worked out, and theirs didn't. A job that came through at the wrong moment, a parent who needed care, a mortgage on an apartment nobody else wanted to buy. In 2021, in an irony almost too pointed to invent, the city was officially given a state honor, celebrating its wartime industrial contributions decades ago. The title celebrates a version of this, places history that conveniently skips past the forced labor, the mass death, and the uprising the state spent years trying to bury. Meanwhile, the actual population the honor was meant to celebrate keeps shrinking faster than that of any other city in the country. And yet, oddly, decline hasn't been the only thing growing here in recent years. Some journalists covering the region have started referring to Vorkuta, only half-jokingly, as the Chernobyl of the North. Not because of any nuclear disaster, but because of the same eerie pull that draws people to places where ordinary life simply stopped mid-motion. Photographers, journalists, and a small but steady trickle of so-called dark tourists have started making the long train journey north, specifically to document what's left. One photography project in recent years spent time methodically capturing the abandoned interiors of nearby settlements, room by room, turning, peeling wallpaper and rusted bed frames into something between documentation and elegy. Some locals find this irritating, watching strangers photograph their hometowns collapse like scenery. Others have leaned into it, half-jokingly calling Vorkuta the unofficial capital of Russian ruin, tourism, and quietly hoping that the attention and the money that occasionally comes with it might be the first small sign of something other than pure decline. Nobody here is pretending a few visiting photographers are going to reopen 9 closed coal mines. But after 30 straight, years of only ever watching the number go down, even a flicker of outside curiosity counts for something. Maybe that's the real story Vorkuta tells, more than any single statistic about temperature or population decline ever could. This is a place built almost entirely on top-down ambition. First, an empire's need for coal at any human cost, then a different government's need to prove a different kind of point. And in both versions, the people actually living here were treated as little, more than an afterthought. And yet here they still are, herding reindeer their ancestors herded, welding together vehicles nobody else makes anymore, painting warnings on stairwells in the hope that somebody listens, simply refusing to let this place finish disappearing on schedule. So maybe the real question isn't why a government keeps spending millions of dollars heating empty buildings in a dying Arctic city. Maybe it's this: how long can any place keep existing on stubbornness alone once the reason it was built in the first place has completely disappeared? Vorkuta might not have an answer to that yet. The mines keep closing. The trains keep leaving, fuller than they arrive, and still, against every incentive that should have emptied this place out. Years ago, the lights keep coming on every evening, in buildings full and empty alike, as if the city itself hasn't quite gotten the memo that it was supposed to have vanished by now. If a story like this pulled you in, that warning painted on a stairwell probably isn't the strangest thing you'll see from a city refusing to disappear on schedule. There are places even more extreme than this one waiting in this channel's archive. If Vorkuta surprised you, tell us in the comments which detail got to you the most. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where we go next, and we'll see you in the next one.